Good morning, everyone. My name is Carla Koppell, and I'm one of the vice presidents here with the United States Institute of Peace. As I hope most of you know, since you're standing in our building, the United States Institute of Peace was founded by Congress over 30 years ago and is committed to the proposition that peace is possible, practical, and cost-effective. Whether you're with us in the room, watching us online, following us on our Twitter feed at #PeoplePowerPeace, which I'm told is all one word, or tweeting about us in the course of this event, we're really happy to have you here with us this morning for what I think will be a very exciting conversation. I speak for all of us at USIP in telling you that we are both pleased and proud to be organizing this conversation in partnership with the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict and the Alliance for Peacebuilding. And it connects with our broader nonviolent action program, as well as the working group we're working on with Alliance for Peacebuilding and community of practice around nonviolent action and peacebuilding. I myself am excited to be able to participate in the conversation for a number of reasons. First of all, I lead the Center for Applied Conflict Transformation here at USIP at the Institute. And this conversation itself will situate, consider, and relate the work around civil resistance with the work focused on peace building within the broader conflict transformation field. So it really is a service to the conversations that we and I have every day. I also look forward to the discussion because it truly brings together leading scholars with some of the foremost practitioners from around the world in the peacebuilding and civil resistance field. And it's quite unique to have that combination of voices come together to have an insightful dialogue. Finally, I really look forward to reflecting back on my own interactions, and as I was looking at the papers that have come out around this conversation and the work that's been undertaken by this team, it made me think back to the work that I did a couple of decades ago talking with members of the African National Congress as they were talking about how to work within an opposition movement and then how to translate that movement into durable gains for their society and for their governance. When I was working in Liberia with women leaders from the Mano River Women's Peace Network, who helped bring an end to the conflict and thought a lot about how they built on that, how they could build on that achievement to deliver long-term for the people of Liberia, particularly its women, and the challenges and struggles and tensions that they felt within their own struggles moving forward. So in sum, I look forward to learning a lot. Within U.S. Institute of Peace, our work around nonviolent action has been a growing area of emphasis for us over the past couple of years. It is people-powered by Maria Stefan, an expert in the field whose leadership I really respect tremendously, and I really enjoy working with her every day on this topic and learn from her every day. The program that she leads has grown and is focused on both undertaking and fostering research into civil resistance efforts and their implications for peace building, as well as really striving to help shape the practices that foster nonviolent action to prevent violent conflict and to promote conflict resolution. They've just released a series of forthcoming reports that you'll hear something about this morning that are really interesting. They also have recently placed online, in partnership with the Academy's Global Campus and American Friends, a couple of courses on nonviolent resistance that I encourage you all to take a look at as well. Very interesting retrospective and analysis of nonviolence, and rich with examples from around the world. With that, I'm going to cede the floor to Maria and a tremendously smart group of experts, and I look forward to sharing with all of you a conversation that I know will be rich and lively. So thank you very much for joining us, and take it away, Maria.
Well, thanks very much, Carla, and let me add my welcome to everybody who's here in the audience and participating in today's event via live webcast. And just a reminder that the hashtag for today's event is People Power Peace. So please do your thing on Twitter, everyone. I would also like to add my thank you to the two co-sponsors for today's event, the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict and the Alliance for Peacebuilding. It's been a real pleasure working with them on this event and also on the Alliance for Peacebuilding Working Group on Nonviolent Action and Peacebuilding, which is really trying to bring together two communities, perspectives, and approaches that have been siloed and not communicating with each other for a very long time. So it's been a pleasure working with both organizations. And I am just really excited to kick off a conversation this morning about the nexus of nonviolent resistance and peace building. And really the central question that we're looking at today is, how can dialogue-based approaches like negotiation, mediation, facilitation, dialogue, together with collective action approaches, strikes, boycotts, civil disobedience, vigils, how can these two approaches and perspectives come together to transform conflicts? And we'll look at some specific examples from around the world where these two approaches have been complementary and where they've been less than complementary. Then before we open the conversation with you all, we're going to preview a new USIP tool for practitioners that animates the synergies between nonviolent action and peace building. And just to emphasize Carla's point about our online courses, kudos to the Global Campus team here at USIP who have worked really hard to put out two online courses that relate to today's topic. One is called Civil Resistance and the Dynamics of Nonviolent Movements, and the other, which we created in partnership with AFSC, is 100 Years of Quiet Diplomacy, Nonviolent Resistance, and Peace Building. So I encourage you all to check those out. And now let me very briefly introduce today's conversation igniters, who are bringing an academic, practitioner, and activist perspective to bear on the topic of people power and peace building. Their full bios, I should note, are in the program for today. So first, Véronique Dudoué is Program Director for Conflict Transformation Research at the Berghof Institute in Berlin, where she manages research on liberation movements, negotiations, inclusive transitions, post-war governance, and civil resistance. She recently edited the book, Civil Resistance and Conflict Transformation, Transitions from Armed to Nonviolent Struggles, and is the author of the ICNC report, which you all should have received outside, Powering to Peace, Integrated Civil Resistance and Peace-Building Strategies. And then we have Jitman Basnet, who is a human rights lawyer and journalist. Jitman has been working for human rights and transitional justice in Nepal for over 16 years. He was kidnapped and tortured by both Maoist rebels and government forces. And in 2004, Amnesty International adopted him as a prisoner of conscience. And he's with us today due to both national and international pressure demanding his release. Next, we have Anthony Juanice St. John, who is an associate professor at the School of International Service at American University. He researches international negotiation and mediation, and conducts advanced negotiations, mediations, and conflict resolution trainings for U.S. military and civilian agencies, international organizations, and NGOs. And he, together with Noah Rosen, are the co-authors of the hot-off-the-press USI Peaceworks report, Negotiating Civil Resistance, which is also available outside. And finally, Abdullah Hendawi is an Egyptian activist and political researcher. While living in Egypt, he was involved in a number of social movements, including the Popular Revolution of 2011. He's worked for different political, governmental, and non-governmental entities focusing on the Middle East and North Africa, and he's currently working with us here at USIP as part of the Nonviolent Action team. So we have a great lineup to start the conversation today. So I'm going to begin with Veronique, who I do have a copy of your special report. I might as well flag it for everyone. Whose ICNC special report, Powering to Peace, has an interesting quote at the beginning. You write in the report, Veronique, that, let's see, where's the quote? Although civil resistance and peace building, both practical strategies and fields of inquiry, share a common commitment to social change and increased justice through peaceful means, they are rooted in distinct approaches to conflict transformation. So can you explain what those distinct approaches are?
Sure, I will. Well, first of all, many thanks for the invitation. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here talking about this work that has been a long time in the making. If I can have the first slide that I had prepared. Yeah. Right, so this is one of the tables that you will find in the report, which tries to highlight, on the one hand, the similarities between civil resistance and peace building, and on the other hand, the main areas of divergence between these two fields, or two approaches to conflict intervention, conflict transformation. So in terms of the commonalities, I would say that civil resistance and peace building both share a commitment to addressing the root causes of conflict, transforming asymmetric or broken relationships in order to build a long-lasting peace with justice, and also the conviction that this long-term peace with justice can only be achieved by peaceful means, without the use of physical force. So I would say they share this joint commitment, which I would say is the essence of conflict transformation. But they are rooted in different ethical orientations, different diagnoses on what are the primary causes of conflict, and they tend to use different methods in order to prosecute conflict or to mitigate conflict. So if I start with peace building, which is like the right-hand column, peace building methods that I'm sure are all very familiar with, given the work of USIP and many of the work that visitors here are conducting. In the report, I adopt a very broad and encompassing understanding of peace building as methods that can be used before, during, and after violence. But their emphasis really is on the search for win-win solutions and constructive relationships. And they promote dialogue, negotiation, reconciliation, institution building, and reform. But I would say that one of the main limitations is that they don't always offer effective solutions for conflicts that are characterized by acute power asymmetries. So on the other hand, civil resistance or nonviolent resistance is primarily used by grassroots movements that are seeking to redress injustice, redress inequality. So they primarily focus on addressing structural violence. And they do that by using methods that intensify conflict in a way, while trying to reduce or oppose the use of violence. Examples include protests, civil disobedience, strikes, and so forth, and also self-organizing and constructive forms of resistance. I would say they can also be employed in different stages of conflict. One of the weaknesses of civil resistance is that because it's used unilaterally by one party to the conflict, it does not always offer effective means to reach win-win solutions, and it may sometimes exacerbate the level of adversity and polarization. And it might also lead to violence by pro-status quo forces. So I would say the essence of the report is that both of these tools and fields need each other, even though they often don't realize it. And there's been quite a divide between these two communities, which I think the report and this panel is trying to address by looking at areas of complementarity. So what the report also does is that it's looking at different stages or different moments in conflict transformation where these approaches can come together and reinforce each other. If I can just have the other slide. Yes, that this is using a model that has been designed by Adam Carla, a Quaker practitioner, activist scholar in the early 70s. And I use this model to show in, I would say, a fairly simplistic manner, the different moments in which civil resistance and peace building can come together in conflicts where transformation has to happen by increasing the level of awareness by the parties that there is a need for social change, and also where conflict transformation has to pass through the changing of power asymmetries so that the parties can talk to each other in a relation of equals. And so these 4 moments are firstly the moment of conscientization and awakening for the need for change. The second stage is the one of conflict intensification by nonviolent means and violence prevention. The third stage is the one where this change in power relations enables parties to come together and to negotiate through bargaining mechanisms a new types of relationship and structural reforms. And then the last stage is the stage of actual social and political transformation for the bargaining outcomes to be institutionalized and put into practice. And where I would say civil resistance remains necessary. There's often the assumption that civil resistance helps parties to negotiate, and then there's no longer a need for popular grassroots mobilization. And the report tries to show how mobilization remains very much necessary in a post-settlement stage to make sure that the peace dividends actually are delivered to the different strands of society.
Thanks, Vernie. That's incredibly helpful to lay out the relationship and how nonviolent action and peace building relate on the conflict spectrum. To take it to a concrete example, you've done extensive research on and even training related to the conflict in Nepal. And as we think about the various phases of that conflict, including the period before, during, and after the signing of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement in 2006, how should we think about the relationship between nonviolent resistance and peace building?
Mm-hmm. Well, in the report, I use the example of Nepal to illustrate 2 of these moments of these 2 approaches coming together. So the first one is exactly looking at what happened in 2006 and the way in which the combined mobilization and pressure by grassroots activists, opposition parties, as well as the Maoists that decided to lay down their arms and to join peaceful protests into what became a people power revolution in 2006, how this pressure helped to force the king to go to the negotiation table. And I think many activists that I spoke to said that that negotiation would not have been possible without that force from the street. And there had been 10 years of armed struggle by the Maoists, and that armed struggle did not manage to convince the monarchy to negotiate a structural change in society, and that revolution managed to achieve that. And then in the report, I also look at another moment of mobilization and complementarity, which is the current stage in which Nepal is trying to come to terms with the legacy of past violence, is trying to come to terms with implementing a new constitution that addresses some of the needs that marginalized communities had raised, but that is very slow in implementing these reforms. And one can see a number of examples of communities that either were historically marginalized or that have become marginalized by the conflict, like victims or like even ex-combatants and child soldiers, taking down to the streets and using different methods of non-violent mobilization to demand the full implementation of these top-down mechanisms that the peace-building process has introduced, like Truth Commission, peace infrastructures and the reforms that have been promised in the constitution, and how beyond the headlines of ethnic riots and so forth, there are actually a number of nonviolent movements that are trying to mobilize. I would say the one challenge is that they're not joining forces. These campaigns are happening rather sporadically, and I think this is also where the peace building methods of negotiation and dialogue can help these different groups build coalitions and join forces to demand the changes that are still to happen.
Great, thank you so much, Veronique. Jitman, this topic is obviously very real for you. You were kidnapped, tortured, held incommunicado by both government and opposition forces while you were advocating for human rights and democracy in Nepal. In thinking about kind of how Veronique described the relationship between the two, how did that work in practice on the ground? How did you experience the relationship between nonviolent action and peace building?
Well, thank you for the question. As Veronique explained, so many issues still, we are struggling now. When King took power, control whole entire, system, he controlled. He dissolved the parliament, kicked out the prime minister. And political parties, they tried to, protest, but didn't get enough support from the people. So the people were witnessing how political party would do. And later, the people from different groups, teachers, students, farmers, and all areas, they joined in the protest and supported to the political parties, and that helped the transformation, change the situation, political situation. There is a combination of nonviolent, action and peace building. Definitely, unfortunately, some violent also, but I would say nonviolent that has the most powerful strength, that helped to overthrow the monarch from Nepal, and nonviolent movement action was able to bring the Maoist combatants, party Maoist force to bring the table to discuss, and also brought the political parties to the table. And at the end, there was a 12-point agreement that happened in New Delhi, and that was a platform of working together, political parties and civic society movement. Mm-hmm. So there is a great combination I experienced. I saw when I was actually, when those things were happening, I was detained in the military barrack. Directly, I couldn't involve, physically in the protest, but, our soul, mind was with them. The prior to begin the peaceful, giant, nonviolent movement that started in April 2005. Afterwards, prior than that, I was involved in various other, strategies like writing articles, protesting, supporting to victims, as a lawyer. So I was not directly 19 days people's movement. We call Jan Andolan in Nepal. At that time, I was outside of country because of threats, continued threats. Also, we were organizing, various types of nonviolent, protest in exile. Mm-hmm. So supporting to the ground, writing articles, supplying, news materials. So there's a great combination of, nonviolent movements and peace buildings. There's another side of great effort from the people, political parties, coming together, overthrowing the monarch, addressing some of the issues people were demanding for a long time, because we have 5-6 decades of democratic history, movement. One, the initial people's protest to overthrow the family regime we call Rana regime that started in 1951, and another phase, the second Jan Andolan we call, that was in 1990. The people were able to, people's power was able to bring the king under the constitution. Prior than that, king was above the constitution. Still, we had to compromise with the king. There was agreement. King agreed to be under the constitution, still so many issues. Political parties were just a puppet of the king, and it still didn't stop the conflict, didn't stop the issues of democracy. And third Jan Andolan, we called the People's Popular Uprising in 2005 and 6, and that was the great experience that various tools were used during the protest. Teachers were teaching their kids in the street. Musicians were singing and dancing. Even we could see some footage today that police personnel, military personnel, where they were clapping. They were enjoying that the people's, the military and police personnel, their families were also there in the protest. They couldn't directly, do anything harmful. But there's other parts that how some militaries and police officers, they were involved in killings and torturing and kidnapping. That another part.
So related to that question, thanks very much, Jitman. You mentioned that there have been significant challenges in the post-peace accord period, including those related to transitional justice and how security forces interact with the civilian populations. And I should note USIP has been facilitating dialogues between Nepali police and communities as part of the Justice and Security Dialogue program for a few years now. So I guess my question to you is, in this kind of fragile context, is there still a role for nonviolent action in civil resistance, or should the focus mainly be on dialogical approaches? Is there still a role today for nonviolent resistance?
Definitely, it's a great question. Yeah, there's always a space for dialogue. Dialogue is one means of bringing different groups together and negotiate. But nonviolence resistance is a strong method that we applied time and again. Still, so many issues are not resolved, not solved, as been said earlier. The political transformation and social and economic changes. There were a number of inequality and caste-based discriminations. So many issues are still not solved. Political parties, they agreed to deliver the constitution and address the transitional justice. I'm one of the victims of conflict that time. Still we have been dealing with these issues. Last 2 years ago, UN Human Rights Committee gave a verdict. We brought the cases to UN Human Rights Committee because Nepal was not a party of the international ICC, International Criminal Court. So we brought cases to UN Human Rights Committee. So it's still that verdict hasn't been implemented. And there are so many victims in the street today. We go to in front of Prime Minister's palace, residence, sometime in administrative office where we call Singadarbar. We protest in front of Chief District Officer's office. We organize various, sometimes we surround the barrack where victims were kept and detained. It's still those issues related to transitional justice, as promised by the political parties. It clearly says all victims, justice would be delivered. What is it? Without justice, there would be a peace. Peace and justice comes together. So justice means is not only the pardon. Justice, there should be a meaningful justice, as you said earlier. So that's a part of the peace process, and which is not delivered yet. And still many victims I see, Ram Bhandari's group, there are many other groups are working, protesting daily basis because their family members are disappeared and government is not responding where they are. And there are many people were killed and their family members are still suffering, and government and political parties were agreed that time to address these issues. It still hasn't been addressed. So what is the option means? As an activist, I go in front of the the relevant, authority, or, for example, prime minister, peace ministers, or chief executive officer, whatever, who are related to and who are responsible for the justice. We go and protest, use meaningful nonviolent resistance tools. Don't harm others, don't kill others, but you can address your issues. Bring your issues, forcefully. So far we are using bandhas, strikes. Still, people are so mad with the bandhas because so many is misused. Some groups are misused the bandhas. That's why people are very unhappy with that. But groups, victims group are organizing bandhas, hartal. Hungry strike. Once I did Hungary strike, asking for justice for all victims, and I was able, how powerful that was, that the government was signed the agreement but didn't apply. That's the unfortunate thing. So still there is a space for changes.
Right.
There are caste discrimination we need to deal with, through the education or protest or whatever we could do. There are so many means, tools we can use. So definitely, still so many things we need to solve, but peace building and nonviolent action, civil disobedience, still we are applying to that.
Thank you very much, Jitman. Now, Anthony, we're back to a slightly more academic perspective on the topic. So you and Noah Rosen have written in a great new PeaceWorks report, Negotiating Civil Resistance, that the success of nonviolent movements in many ways depends on the quality of the negotiations it maintains. So what do you mean by that exactly?
Well, to take a prior step, since this is academic after all, we have to frame it, right? We'd long been interested in the dichotomy between the two fields. And friends of mine, colleagues of mine here at USIP years ago, Dominic Kirley and Darren Cambridge, asked me to think about creating a training exercise in negotiation for nonviolent activists, for one of the initial courses. And that got me thinking about the tensions and the differences. And then you asked me to think about this in a more systematic way and put our thoughts down on paper with this report. So it made me really aware of the ways in which the two communities of negotiation scholars and practitioners and civil resistors had seized to understand that they were speaking similar languages and came from similar motivations. But as we look at the good cases, at work like yours, it's really empirical, that shows what nonviolent social movements have been able to accomplish in a century. There's a lot of negotiation there that tends to be sort of hidden under the dramatic action, the drama of direct action takes the center stage. But there are a lot of biographical and autobiographical works, narratives that show that at critical moments, certainly there are negotiations to take the leverage generated by direct action and get gains from whoever it is you're trying to get gains from, government, corporate world, etc. Change laws. So that was our initial, observation. But we broadened our view and we realized that there are negotiations 360 degrees around civil resistance campaigns. And probably the principal one is about what kind of coalitions you build across society. How inclusive is the movement? Do you have all the right people? Do you get to the 3.5% that some famous authors have written about? That was a joke.
That was funny.
Do you have a broad enough spectrum of people that can also act with some unity and articulate a concrete agenda for change. So that's the first sphere of negotiation. The second one is about co-opting the structures of power, police, military, especially in situations of desired regime change. Can you take parts of the pillars of support of government and get them acting on behalf of an agenda for change that is well articulated and well led and cohesive and unitary? So there's negotiations to do that, for sure. And then finally, it's not a billiard ball sort of image of movement, action, and change. There are negotiations to change government, change constitutions, change laws, effect transitional justice measures and make sure they're implemented and followed up on, and change societal norms so that you don't end up with really a repeat of what you had before. So we see negotiations in all of those spheres.
And is there an example from your research that sticks out as being a particularly good case where nonviolent action or nonviolent resistance and peacebuilding negotiations specifically came together?
You know, one of the earlier cases when I was a younger man was about the Polish Solidarity movement and how they essentially negotiated their way into power to get General Jaruzelski and his regime moving out of power and having a democratic movement start to change the way that they, do politics in post-communist Poland. More recently, of course, the Arab Spring cases offer us a lot of food for thought, and I'm sure Abdallah will get us deeper into the details since he lived it. But the Tunisian example seems to have had a lot of dialogical elements, a lot of negotiations, both among the different civil society elements and movements, so that they can create a cohesive agenda across different political parties and ideological tendencies, but also with the elements of the prior regime, to keep certain things in place in a transitional phase and then begin the task of reforming all the different laws and institutions of the country. In contrast, there's the Egyptian example, which was dramatically successful in getting some important changes moving, but then didn't coalesce. And Abdallah will talk much more about that.
Great, thanks so much, Anthony.
Thank you.
So Abdullah, you were actually in Tahrir Square during the popular uprising that led to the ouster of President Mubarak in 2011, and you were also part of negotiations with the security forces during that time. And so maybe you can talk us through those experiences, and in particular, what were you trying to achieve in the negotiations with the security forces?
Thanks, Maria. The interesting part is that the more I think about this stage now, the more I think that negotiations actually didn't start by the time we sat on the table and talked together. In fact, negotiations started back in 2005 when actually we started taking the streets. And I mean, negotiations are traditionally known to be like between these two different parties and so on. And of course, there are different types of negotiations. But for me, thinking about this stage now, making me think that we started to gain power and leverage when we started taking the streets in 2005 and scaling up our mobilization up until 2011 when the streets started to really react with us and join the crowd. However, thinking about how did we take these negotiations into the level of sitting on the same table and talking to the generals was a whole different thing. Because we moved from what we didn't realize as negotiations to what we see and realize as negotiations. So when we sat on the table, let me go back a little bit for a second. Now, when we took the streets and we started to feel that we do have the power in the streets, that in fact, as much as it empowered us, it also scared the military generals and the military council members on the other hand. So they felt the need to sit with us, and they started to extend the invitations for the first time in their entire life to sit with a bunch of kids, as they always like to describe us. And so those bunch of kids finally had a voice. But those bunch of kids also did not have one voice, right? We had multiple voices, multiple understandings, although one goal, but different approaches. However, despite how many different approaches and different ideologies and different groups these social movements were, they all rejected sitting on the table at that time during the 18-day revolution in Tahrir Square. But the only faction that actually sat together was the military council, was the Muslim Brotherhood. They were shamed for that, they were criticized, and they quickly backtracked and joined the crowds, and they said, okay, we're not going to be part of that. But they have actually met the vice president at the time, who was also just the chief of the intelligence and military council. So it was a perplexing situation. When the 18-day revolution was over, when Mubarak stepped down, that was a game changer for us. We finally realized that, well, now we actually have power. We negotiated without really sitting at the table, and we were able to bring them down. But here's the catch. Because civil resistance and peace building / negotiation, and as everyone agrees, are distinct, we didn't realize that we were setting ourselves in a trap. Now, what I mean by that is that people in civil resistance are different than people in peace building. My personal opinion, I still see peace building as still an elitist, rational, responsible approach, right? Now, people in the street do not think this way. To give an example, people in the street, although they do not want to be violent, but one little kid like that, having one stone, throwing it, breaking one window, he is the star, and this is what the media would see, and that how would the people react to that? So he's the little kid, irrational, doing that, igniting a whole sort of violence throughout the streets. And that happens. And if the crowd do not self-discipline itself, which is rare, but if that happens, if that doesn't happen, it's going to be a mess. And again, do I see the Egyptian revolution as a 100% non-violent revolution? Well, this is a discussion that we have had through the revolutions. What do we mean actually by non-violence? Self-defense, is it non-violence? Is hunger strike non-violence? Although I'm harming myself, not harming others. So there are lots of discussions about that. But at the end of the day, what we thought that we will self-discipline as much as we can. We will try to educate the crowd, which was a very difficult process. At the end of the day, we managed to have it in the most non-violent possible way. When, again, revolution was over, or let's say the uprising was over, Mubarak stepped down. Now we had to switch gears between the civil resistance, the revolutionaries, these people taking the streets, into the rational, responsible negotiators who sit on the table and have the demands set and organized and prioritized, etc. But that was not realistic. First, we were different. We had so many groups. Each group had its own distinct approach. The most organized of them was the Muslim Brotherhood, in fact. So they were actually the ones who sat on the table, was the military council, able to secure an agreement and a deal for the future. And they benefited from that to the extent that they reached their highest position as being a president, right? And they had the parliament, they had the government, they had the president's office, they had everything they thought they could get. Whereas the other bunch of kids who actually started the revolutions being disorganized and are only able to be civil resistance but could not really switch gears to be this rational peace builders or the rational negotiations, they failed to do so. When we even had the chance, and that's the most important one, when we had the chance to sit together on the table with the generals, and I was involved in that on multiple cases and multiple times, there was one time when we were sitting with the military generals, able to talk with them about multiple things. What happened is that we found part of our friends who've known us very well, they were criticizing us, they were shaming us. So they were shaming us because we shook hands with people who have been involved in killing the rest of our friends. Now I understand that, but here is another important cultural factor that plays in halting negotiations. Now, I thought the negotiations could do something, but there are multiple other factors like cultural politics, mobilization, the ability to organize could play into how these negotiations get derailed from where they should be.
Great, thanks, Abdullah. So if you could turn the clock back and redo one aspect of the Egyptian revolution, what would it be?
Well, I wish I had an answer. I wish I had a perfect answer. I would have been a billionaire. Probably I would have been the president of Egypt by the time. But
Besides being the president of Egypt.
Besides being the president of Egypt, I think I really would have rethought about how do we approach our relationship with the military council at the time. There was great rejection for all the atrocities the military council have been involved at, for many of the atrocities of the police forces have had. But our approach, or the I'd say the revolutionary approach at the time, was to completely exclude and isolate those elements. And while I understand that there is frustration against elements of people involved in violence, but I think excluding and isolating them does nothing but polarization and antagonizing them against us, which was exactly what happened, because these people who were isolated and excluded eventually brought themselves together and then backtracked and then attacked us a few months afterwards. And because they had the power, they had the plans, they knew exactly how the bureaucracy in Egypt works, they were able to counterattack us in the smartest way and completely destroy us to the extent that most revolutions now are, I mean, not even revolutions, but also the Muslim Brotherhood, either imprisoned, tortured, killed, or sent to exile and are not able to come back to Egypt. And the only ones who are able to run Egypt now and have this great solidarity among themselves were the elements that we thought must be excluded. So if there's something that what I would have actually done is to work more into the integration and reintegration of those elements instead of just pushing them away from the society.
It's fascinating. Thanks, Abdullah. So this is going to open up for the entire panel, and it relates to your last point about inclusion, exclusion, and this whole idea that in some contexts, civil resistance can possibly pave the way to violence and greater polarization. So I want to ask the entire panel, actually, what is your response to this? How do you respond to the critique that, in certain contexts, civil resistance can actually exacerbate divisions, go against inclusion, promote polarization? Is there something legitimate about that? Go ahead.
Should I start? Well, thanks for the great question. I think I would want to give a response in two steps. The first step would be to say that in theory, when one thinks about civil resistance in the way that it has been conceived by its founding fathers like Gandhi and Martin Luther King, it should provide techniques that would at the same time intensify the level of conflict so that it can be transformed, but also try to break the spiral of destructive relations and lay the groundwork for intergroup reconciliation. But what we find is that in most actual nonviolent campaigns, and especially when a conflict has already been polarized by years of mistrust or injustice, or repression, etc., it's very difficult to convince activists to seek fraternization, right, with the other side, to not hate the adversary, to apply these ground rules like separating the problem. We are fighting the problem, but we don't fight the people, or maximizing contacts, etc. These are very difficult techniques to apply, and they would require, obviously, very long-term training, preparation, planning, also to avoid the appearance of radical flanks that might be tempted to use violence and therefore increase polarization and so forth. So I think, that would be one ingredient. And I think also if we think about this interplay between civil resistance and peace building, I think it would be important for nonviolent activists to understand that what they seek might not necessarily be the coercion of the other side, because this might lead only to short-term solutions, but that there's some value to negotiation, accommodation, and if that thinking enters the movement quite early on, it will probably be then adapting techniques that will make it possible to have an inclusive accommodation after the struggle.
Great, that's a helpful insight. Any other perspectives on the issue of polarization, exclusion, and how it relates to nonviolent resistance, and essentially how it can be overcome over the course of a movement?
Definitely, on the ground, we have been seeing sometimes conflicts between the different countries. I mean, the groups, ethnic groups, ethnic violence. So we should very careful utilizing tools, nonviolent actions, or different tools, not separating societies. So what is happening in Nepal, is, one group is asking for rights, protesting, demanding. Sometimes other group, they feel that they're, they're protesting against us. For example, in Torai, in flatland border with India, the people, some political groups, people, they were protesting, asking for, so many other things, their demands, but targeting to the people from the hills, like wearing the Nepali cap, targeting them, So, and Eastern Hills, we saw, some ethnic groups rise, Limbus and Sherpas, and their issues with the government, but different groups, different ethnic groups living in the same society, they are not the target and they are not the main cause of, and what we experience is sometimes civil resistance, protest, if we are not careful, that could create a division or sectorial violence or ethnic violence, and people feel that they are targeting us. I give an example that there once upon a time, not a long time, it still exists, that some group of people who have some kind of nose, sharp nose. It's called, the nose, people who have sharp nose. They are the cause of the regime, they were the ruler. Even, a porter carrying, heavy backpack for surviving. And some group of people, they see that he has a sharp nose, so he should be from the ruling groups, regimes. There's nothing to do with, there's no relation. There are people living in the same society, they are poor, struggling for food, jobs and different things, but somehow they see that, the group is, related to the regime. The nose, my nose is sharp, so what is the problem with other groups? So, sometimes this, if we don't apply, or we are not careful, we apply the methods that could definitely create the division, social division.
So this is a case where the protests, if they were targeting a particular ethnic group, tribal group, religious group, it can be highly problematic in terms of potentially exacerbating conflict and promoting violence.
Exactly, and that makes the civil resistance, the non-violent actions or border people's protest, less important.
And maybe this is a question for Anthony. In the conflict resolution field in literature, there is this notion of ripeness, which comes from William Zartman and other scholar practitioners. The idea that in order to get to a negotiated settlement, the situation needs to be ripe. And this is often talked about in the context of negotiating techniques. How can different negotiating techniques promote and pave the way to a negotiated settlement? In your view, is there a relationship between nonviolent resistance, nonviolent action, and ripeness? And kind of the flip side, are there cases where nonviolent resistance can make a situation unripe for negotiated settlement?
So ripeness, of course, is about the psychological readiness as well as the more objective conditions under which people, individuals, or institutions say, now's the time to cut a deal rather than to continue to fight whoever our adversary is. Now, nonviolent action, if it's well crafted, if it's broad and legitimate and powerful, can, of course, ripen a social conflict. It could incline whoever the other party is to say we should stop our violent or harmful actions and think about getting out of this situation. So that's, I think, the fundamental logic of the big bargain, of the fundamental bargain between direct action and negotiation. Mm-hmm. You can overclaim, however, And that's a danger for all movements that have a grievance or a claim that they feel they're entitled to. If you overclaim, then you push the other party so far out and leave them with so few options that they might say, we have no option except to try to destroy the movement that's making that demand. And I think the Syrian opposition has been the biggest illustration of that problem, with the constant return to the demand that Assad must go and cannot be part of any transition. They've essentially, given Assad little incentive to go, which is exactly what we'd like. So if you overclaim, you will unripen.
Okay, very interesting.
Even if you have generated leverage.
Very interesting. So, in many conflict zones, it's not just a question of nonviolent, opposition groups and government forces or corporations. You have violent actors, extremist elements, Boko Haram, ISIS, for example, that are operating, in the same space as nonviolent movements, other armed groups. How should we, in these contexts, whether it's, northern Nigeria or Afghanistan or Syria, how should we think about the relationship between the nonviolent resistance and peace-building techniques when it comes to things like countering violent extremism?
Tricky question. In the classic post-Cold War civil wars, you had armed groups that had a political front or a political party, and they would work in clandestine or open coordination with each other. Think about El Salvador or Guatemala. Situations today are a little more fragmented, and you don't have everybody working for the same things. Think about Abu Sayyaf in the Philippines that has no civil society backing. Do you need to co-opt Abu Sayyaf in order to get better political change in Mindanao? Probably not. On the other hand, in a place like Nigeria, where you have so many multiple sub-regional conflicts, different groups looking for local satisfaction of local grievances, and then you have, Boko Haram in the northeast, etc. I guess the tendency would be, how do you build the broadest coalition for the most reasonable agenda for change? And who's going to be in that permanently? And who will exclude themselves from that? Today there's an event here on Burma's peace process, which has, dozens and dozens of armed groups, some of which are small, some of which are very large, many of whom are not part of their ceasefire agreement that's been in place for some years now. And the desire, I think, is for the Institute and for the United States to support a broad inclusion of those groups in a desire to get them to support nonviolent political change and get the government to go along with that. Mm-hmm. So it's pushing them all towards a fairly broad consensus.
Mm-hmm. Veronique, did you have any thoughts on that?
I can add something. I'm trying to think of contexts where there's especially violent extremist groups operating in an area and where the call to support nonviolent mobilization is obviously very challenging, right, and can also be ethically challenging by putting them at risk and on the spot. But I do think that such contexts require a mix of simultaneous strategies. So on the one hand, supporting nonviolent mobilization by communities that are affected and whose pressure has to apply towards all sides that are fighting. And I'm thinking of examples like peace communities in Colombia, or even like in Liberia, the women that appealed to the rebel groups as well as to the government to come and sit at the table. So there's some pressure that can be applied, but by also bringing protection mechanisms, right, to make sure that these grassroots activists are not put too much at risk, and there can be local mechanisms for protection and monitoring, I think. And at the same time, I think the one has to look at entry points for local engagement with these violent extremist actors. I'm not saying that it should be the US government going to talk to Boko Haram or Al-Shabaab. I'm not that naive, but they're on the ground. There's many bridge builders that can potentially be identified, whether these are imams or elders, traditional leaders, local civil society groups that have legitimacy on all sides that can open the door and try and engage these actors. So I would say, yeah, trying to really really operate on both levels of pressure from the ground as well as engagement to de-escalate the situation.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So maybe one last question for the whole panel, and I'll start with you, Abdullah, if you have thoughts on this. So, we've been speaking about kind of the need for these two communities, nonviolent resistance, peace building, to be in greater communication, to have more dialogue. So, what would be your advice to practitioners and policymakers for how to promote greater synergies between the nonviolent resistors and the peace builders of the world?
I think that's an important question. My approach would be that many of these training courses and workshops and so on that are prepared for many of the activists around the world are actually teaching people that these are different things. It's either you are an activist and nonviolent resistor, or you're a peace builder and negotiator, and that's a different thing. So this has to change. People must know that not people, but I'm just saying that the policymakers, the donor organizations, the NGOs, the transnational networks of activists must provide this new curriculum of training and preparation, that there is no distinct difference between these two. You can be both. You can be an activist civil resistance, and at the same time you can also work towards peace and negotiations at the same time. You don't have to be in a fancy suit and in a certain approach to go and sit with someone and tell them, hey, I'm a negotiator, my name is this and this, here's my business card. This is not how negotiations often could be. It could also be that you're somebody who is resistor or a revolutionist coming from social movements, but also able to secure sort of a negotiation. And that has to start back from the trainings that really shapes the minds of the activists and also the academic community.
Great, thanks, Abdullah. Any other thoughts on practically how do we move this agenda forward?
Nonviolent civil resistant movements need to have a well-articulated strategic goal. It can't just be about destruction. There has to be a goal that brings a wide group of people into the mobilization and then gives them hope of something different after that mobilization. So strategic goals really matter, and then the means by which we achieve them really matter.
Thanks.
Yeah, definitely in practical way, nonviolent resistance, it definitely is a nonviolent. So should not be harm to any groups, in the society. But what is the goal? What is the aim? What are the agendas? What are the demands? And where we should table those demands, Just protesting each other, as I mentioned earlier, that could create ethnic violence, a division in the society that makes, the movement weaker, and people fight each other. We have been seeing in many countries, mostly in African countries, that, two groups are fighting each other. But issues are different, not the color or not the race or not the religion or anything, but issue, democracy, changes, transformation, opportunities. There could be many other issues people might have. And what is our way, how you could make an approach to the right place, to the government or some bodies. People, activists, organizers should be very careful that the tools we utilize, as I mentioned earlier, bandhas. We have been in Nepal. We have been, using bandhas.
Maybe just say one word, because it may not be known to the audience exactly what that is.
Bandha. It's a strike. Block it.
General strike.
General strike. Block it. I give you one example that it's a good way. Just put pressure to the government or a concerned body that just blocking the road. Everything, no movement. And the bad part of this, strike, the bandhas, is, sometimes people misuse. I give you one example. That one incident happened. That the bus was, running, and there was a rooster on the way. The boss killed the rooster. Then all villagers, they came forward. it stopped everything. There was long time strike. The demand was, to pay back. What is the cost to 300 Nepalese currency is to $3 here, US dollar. The demand was, like $500,000. Or you should pay back. If you don't pay back, then no one can move. The simple thing, one rooster was killed. It's crossing the road, bus hit the rooster. It's the misuse of resistance.
So the main takeaway from that story is that roosters should not be protesting in the streets.
Definitely.
That's the only way.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah. There could be a drivers group could say, "Oh, don't let roosters, counter."
Yeah. Great, thanks, Jivan. How about you, Veronique, about practically how to promote synergies between nonviolent resistance and peace building?
Right. Well, I would first encourage you to read the report that has a section at the end on kind of key learning points for different communities. So whether these are nonviolent activists or trainers, but also there's a section at the end which is, okay, what should peace building donors and policymakers and practitioners learn from all of these talk about synergies? And so there's a few of these lessons. One, for instance, focuses on the need for a shift from a conflict prevention mindset to a violence prevention mindset. So there's been a lot of talk in the last 2 years with the UN report on sustaining peace and so forth, that conflict prevention has to be emphasized everywhere. And I think what the report shows is that if conflict is avoided at all costs, this might actually be ethically problematic if it leads to a reinforcing of the status quo and a prevention of structural change, and so therefore violence should be preventing at all costs. So that's kind of more of a general principle. There's some other windows of opportunity, I would say, at the global policy agenda, and for instance the UN Sustainable Development Goals that are emphasizing in the Goal 16 on building inclusive and peaceful societies. This focus on inclusion is very important for peace building itself, but I think it also offers a way of raising awareness of the need to include social movements, nonviolent movements as well in peace-building processes. And I'm sure you're all aware of this tendency for inclusive decision-making spaces like a national dialogue to bring in civil society, but only in the form of professional NGOs and a few selected representatives. And then the tendency is for the real change makers on the street that have been engaged in asking for change, let themselves being represented by others that speak in their names, and this disconnect, I think, prevents real change from happening later on. So again, this search for inclusive conflict settlements should really make sure that activists are the voices that should be heard, and not only those that carried out weapons that are heard, or like professional civil society voices. So yeah, this is just a couple of examples of what can be done to maybe put more emphasis on nonviolent resistance alongside peace building.
Yeah, I mean, you're actually flagging a fascinating research topic, which is what is the relationship between national dialogue processes, which is something USIP focuses on quite a bit, and social movements and nonviolent activism. Like, where can they come together, where can they not, that kind of thing. So that's an interesting, and the linkage to the SDGs is also very helpful. So thank you. Veronique. So I'm now going to invite to the stage, before we have a nice conversation with you all, Lisa Shirk and Nadine Block, please come up together. So Lisa Shirk is the research director for the Toda Institute for Global Peace and Policy Research. She's a senior policy advisor for the Alliance for Peace Building and a professor at Eastern Mennonite University. And Nadine Block is the training director for Beautiful Trouble, an organization that advances creative activism. She's also the author of a USIP special report on the role of education and training in nonviolent resistance, which is out on the display table. table. So Lisa and Nadine have actually been working on a new tool for practitioners that kind of animates and makes very concrete the conversation we've been having today on the nexus of nonviolent resistance and peace building. So I just wanted to invite them to give a very brief preview of this training guide.
Great. Thanks for having us here, and thank you so much for this really insightful and evocative conversation on many levels. So as you can see, we're calling our practical guide SNAP, Synergizing Nonviolent Action and Peace Building. And the real underlying reason for this work, besides the fact that we both are educator, trainer, facilitators, and are interested in advancing what we're talking about today, which was the synergy of the two, is that we are interested in increasing success of movements. And as you've just heard, you've just heard a really wonderful explanation of the fields that would come into play when we're talking about doing this work.
Okay. So some of the content actually goes kind of through the different steps, from thinking about what the strengths and weaknesses are of each of these fields. And the synergy part is why together they're actually each more able to be successful because of the energy that they bring, actually adding up to more than the sum of the parts. And then we start with conflict assessment and environmental scans. So we're using tools from both of the fields, sort of in a combined way, which I don't think has been done before, to try to bring together how do we set up good strategic planning, both for peace-building processes as well as for nonviolent action. So the overall frame is actually very much focused on success and strategic planning. So getting to the final chapters of the book, which get to BATNA, the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. How do we start thinking in terms of win-win? What does the opponent needs? What are their interests? How do we reach a sustainable outcome or negotiation outcome settlement so that the outcome is not then questioned and people can be sustainable in the outcome?
And the one thing that I'll add, we were really striving to produce something that was useful or practical. So we have a great emphasis in each of the units on exercises or applied things that you can do with the knowledge that will support the work that we think will help us be more successful as nonviolent activists and as peace builders. And we also have a big commitment in this idea that it will be useful to not making it a 3,000-page tome that you'll never pick up. So it's not completely inclusive, but rather selective of particular things within the strategic arc of success, of incorporating what people might call formal dialogue, or just simply the ability to talk to each other on the street in a way that's not alienating, all the way up to formal negotiation, or the ability to come to the table and not distance yourself from fellow activists and destroy your movement. So there's that whole spectrum, and it's based in practical exercises, some of which you may have seen before and some of which are completely new, that we've developed in this moment where there seems to be a very helpful interest in reintegrating the spectrum of tools that are available to nonviolent activists and peace builders.
Okay, thanks very much, Lisa and Nadine. And that's, we're very excited, yes, they deserve a round of applause. We're very excited for that guide to come out within the next few months. So we now have plenty of time to have a conversation with you all. I believe we have 2 mics and 2 mic runners. So if folks just want to raise their hand and we'll get you the mic, please introduce yourself, offer your affiliation, and just keep the questions, comments terse and pithy. Thanks. So in the very back in the blue.
Morning, my name is Ashok Panikar and I'm with Metaculture. Thank you so much. This was really refreshing and extraordinarily timely. I would like to have the panel focus for a moment on what's happening in this country. Because this is exactly the kind of challenge that I am working with right now, particularly in the campuses, where the anger and almost hatred of my own peer group, the liberal left progressives, towards anybody who disagrees with them, is completely shutting down conversations from the right and the conservatives, and in the process creating a backlash which could be extraordinarily dangerous. So I see people power happening, but given that as a mediator and a facilitator, I've been trying to get groups together to talk about these things. The inability of some of my colleagues to even get people to the table, because the progressives don't necessarily believe that there's any reason to talk to people who disagree with them. So I would love to hear from the panel how you feel we could actually address some of these issues close to home. Thank you.
So we're not, that's a great question. Thank you very much, and thank you for your activism. Without getting into details on the domestic context and the political situation here, to address his question, kind of how should activists in general think about getting to the negotiating table, and what lessons would be relevant here from other cases? Yeah.
I sat down with a group of housing activists some years ago, New York housing activists, for a negotiation training that their leadership had set up for them. And they just hated me for 48 hours. And I finally said, why do you people hate this training and me personally so much? And one of them finally timidly said, you know, we don't see ourselves as negotiators. We're right. And the mayor and the city council are our targets. We just want to burn the house down. We don't want to talk to them. And then I asked, well, what happens if the mayor and the city council invite you in to talk about solutions to your concerns? And then there was stunned silence. So they had not really thought through, can we be part of the solution? They saw themselves as the mobilizing, coercive element rather than the creative, synergistic element. So I think part of the answer to your question is that people who advocate for change and have grievance need to look at some of our pioneering figures, like King, like Gandhi. They were not about hatred and othering, even though they understood how to mobilize a community that has grievances and faces injustices. They also knew how to hold up the humanity of the other, so that whatever change comes is not a new destructive change. Even if you have to destroy old structures, you still have to build peace with whoever was part of that old structure at some level. I'll stop there.
That's really helpful. Holding up the humanity of the other, even as one is engaged in nonviolent resistance and activism.
Very hard to do.
Thank you. Another question. Sure, right here.
Thank you. Nizar Farsakh, I'm a leadership and negotiations trainer, in fact, and involved in a few nonviolence initiatives in Palestine and Israel. My question is actually to take this further, right? The question of polarization is, in fact, maybe polarization is the wrong word, because what you're doing is you're agitating, you're conscientiation, I think you said, Veronique, which is you're shedding light to an injustice or a status quo that's not tenable, right? So when we're, in fact, in organizing, we say we polarize to mobilize, and we compromise to settle, right? So the whole idea of mobilization is precisely to get to the negotiating table to begin with, right? But if that's not clear in the design of the mobilization, then that's the problem, right? Because there isn't that expectation, and there is this expectation of capitulation. So in your experience, what are things that we can do to enable, as interveners, right, to enable both sides, the powerful and those with less power, to see the importance of maybe not the legitimacy of the other, but that you're gonna need to, you won't get your objectives without some sort of work with the other. What are things that actually have worked in debunking the capitulation theory of change, that the other needs to capitulate? They cannot, whether the government needs to see that the nonviolent movement failed because they don't want further ones, or the resistance, right? Realizing that if they want to destroy and completely annihilate the powerful, then it's highly unlikely that they're going to succeed. And in fact, we've seen many revolutions ending up being worse dictatorships than the ones they replace. So what are things that actually have worked in sensitizing people in realizing the importance of collaboration?
So how to constructively engage the other in the context of nonviolent struggles?
Well, I'm a scientist, so I always think the power of evidence is what works best. But I understand that it doesn't work for everyone, right? So, what would work for me would be, you come with figures that show, okay, well, actually, negotiative settlements were much more long-lasting than defeat or victory over the other side. But yeah, as I said, it might not work for everyone. So I'm sure there's more kind of visual and colorful ways of demonstrating that examples from elsewhere. I think the difficulty of working with activists that don't get that early on is that then it makes them very bad negotiators, and we've heard that very clearly from Egypt, right? Activists made very bad negotiators, and so if you then bring them to the table without having them like really ready and prepared for the need that at some point they'll have to sit with the other and negotiate mutually working solutions in an inclusive way, then they'll completely lose out. And the problem is that most negotiation trainings are done with armed groups, with governments, but activists are not trained into negotiation, and I think this also has to become very much part of the training repertoire. Sorry, that was my attempt at answering.
Makes sense. Any other thoughts on that? Because it's a great question.
Yeah, I just add a few points. The win-win solution is a great idea of negotiation. If you look at Libya, what happened after the revolution, that was completely, defeated movement. One group was completely, wiped out, replaced by various, uprising factors, groups. And what happened, result is that created a vacuum and created different divisions, and still they have been fighting. So the best idea I have noticed, seen, study is a negotiation-based negotiation. Give space to the other side also. And there is definitely changing scenario, situation, system would definitely be changed, and other group, the regime or dictator, whatever we say, give them a space that they could exist, not in the powerful position, like we are doing. Our king is living still in Nepal. We didn't force him to go out. Mm-hmm. So he has a space, but he's not in power, and that was negotiating. We negotiated. We said with the king, parties, definitely. Activists were not in the negotiating table. Different political parties and king and different groups were there, but not the activists. We were not there. So it was negotiated. So it is a best model of conflict resolution. Mm-hmm. And the other group, the regime or former dictator or king or whatever, would not feel that I was defeated. Mm-hmm. So they have a space. Otherwise, that would create a vacuum and create a destructive, anti-force, whatever is happening. Like, for example, look at the Iraq. The Shia group, Maliki, Prime Minister Maliki, he forced out the vice president that represented the Sunni groups.
You're talking about Iraq, not Syria.
Iraq, yeah. Mm-hmm. And already Sunni groups were, thinking that their rights were, violated or suppressed by the Shia groups. They had, classes, and the Ba'ath parties were always, Saddam was gone, but their people were there already there. So the check and balance didn't have, quite equal, and the Maliki government was not careful. Same thing is happening in Sudan, South Sudan. The ethnic violence now is a result of the representatives from the other side too. So one group feels that this is my country, I'm powerful and every powerful seats or position should be from my group, and other group feels isolated and takes arms and creates the division.
All right, thank you very much. Next question. In the pink, in the middle.
Thank you very much. My name is Maskara Masafa. I'm from Ethiopia. I was activist for human trafficking and advocating for women domestic workers in the Middle East. But today I'm very happy to be here because I'm talking about peace. So something makes me afraid. Sorry for my English because this is my second language. When we talk about peace in my country, like Ethiopia, there is a lot of ethnic groups, almost 72. The government divides these ethnic groups by a language. So these ethnic groups are, right now, they are fighting each other. If you look at the media, it's like people take actions, and our Ethiopian is the historical part of Ethiopia because we are living together, eating together, married each other. Right now is everybody separating, and then if you pass other place, somebody kill you and cut your breast. So with this kind of things happen, because people is a power, but people is a divide. How can we bring to all these peoples together to make a peace first before a negotiation the government, because the government, his target is already divide us to make us very weak. So I'm afraid people were migrants out of the country, and then when we come in here, we are very weak. We don't have any power to say something. And the other thing is everybody, we are afraid to talk because our families back home, they will attack them automatically because our government is very strong, people everywhere. My question is how to bring our people together like before. They are loving each other, married each other, eating each other, and make one Ethiopia together. That's my question, how to bring them all together.
That's a really great question, and I think this is a vexing one. How do you, in deeply divided societies, help bridge those divides? And what is the relevance of both nonviolent action and, peace-building processes like negotiations and the like? Does somebody want to tackle that? Abdullah, go ahead.
Yeah, I feel you. That's exactly how I feel about being away from home. And this question that I try to think of an answer for it every day. But what I want to say is that in the diaspora, many groups, starting from back in the Cuban Revolution, struggle against Batista, the Burmese in the diaspora, and many other diaspora groups have been successful in trying to help local communities back home to continue their struggle and their advocacy on behalf of human rights. The thing is that now we're no longer living in a world where there's no connections. That brings me back to your point. The gentleman was talking about activism here. Activism is no longer located in a specific geographical location. You don't have to be in Ethiopia to advocate for human rights. You can be here, do advocacy from here. In fact, it could be even better because here you're able to more express yourself, are able to mobilize, are able to talk to people, are able even to raise funds and send it back home in multiple ways. There is a big role for people who are in the exile to work on behalf and support people back home. In terms of how to bring unity to the activists back home and to remain in one country, because we have seen examples where civil resistance and struggle could lead to a lot of divides. I think that relies a lot on the narratives adopted in the activism discourses. What kind of language do we talk about? Who are people that are joining our groups, etc., etc. There are multiple things. But we always have a great chance to do that, even if you are in the exile.
I want to add something. It's really, I heard your voice, how difficult situation would be on the ground, and fighting each other, sectarial violence is the most dangerous violence in the world that kills everyone, no matter who, what, where, children, women, adults, everyone fighting each other, both groups killing each other, and never ends, and revenge, ongoing violence. So in Nepal, we have more than 100 ethnic groups. Small country, located between India and China, a small country, 26 million people, more than 100 languages, more than 100 ethnic groups. We have been living together, in the same society. Rarely we fight, not fighting each other, hitting each other. And there are some, tradition, customs we apply, I want to share one example that could be useful to spread the message in the world who are fighting. We have a meat culture. Meat culture, have you heard of the meat culture? Meat means we declare meat. A male, one male person or female, girl, woman, whatever it is, from one group, not from the same group, and the male or female or whoever from other group, they declare meat. That means a great friendship. Friendship, a great friendship, not only simple friendship. They take a responsibility of other families too. So meat family, I have a meat family here in the United States. I love them. So meat families from two groups, two ethnic groups. They celebrate. It's not a marriage like a boy and boy or girl. It's totally different than the marriage. But they love two families and their relatives. For example, two are mates, one guy and other guy, two guys from two groups, but they're relatives, 100, 200. Meet father, meet mother, meet auntie, meet nephew, so many. Meet friends too. My meets friend. So, that is the idea that bringing people, different ethnic groups together.
Interesting.
We have big celebration. We invite hundreds. Depends on how big their society, family is. People invite their families, friends together and celebrate. And then there are responsibility. If something happens to my families, they shake hands. They come together. They support. They help. And this idea is working very well. That more than 100 ethnic groups in Nepal, living in Nepal, they don't fight each other. Even religious violence, we don't. Very rarely religious violence exists in Nepal. We love each other's religions. We don't hate each other. Muslim. We don't hate Muslims. We don't hate Christian. We don't hate Hindus, Buddhists. We visit each other's temples. Respecting each other's. That's the idea.
One wishes that could happen elsewhere, of course.
Yeah.
So Veronique, I know you had a quick point on this issue of how to address deeply divided societies, because I actually think this is one area where the two fields really need to converge, and that the negotiators have a lot to say on this.
Your question made me think of this very recurrent pattern of governments using these divide and rule strategies everywhere, right, to make sure that those that demand change are not going to be strong enough to act together. And I think one can look at examples, and what I understood is that in Ethiopia there's a number of ethnic armed groups that are not working together but are working against each other. And I think it's possible to look at examples like Myanmar that has been cited before, where various ethnic armed groups managed to actually join some form of loose coalition to have a inclusive negotiation table. But also there have been cases where divided societies that create divided armed groups, have managed to realize that actually by changing strategies and by transforming their struggle strategies from armed strategies to non-violent strategies has enabled this coalition building that is so important for change to happen. And Nepal is one of many examples where the Maoist armed group, but also very divided political parties, some of which were representing various ethnic interests, had managed to bring meet in India for like an internal negotiation between them to agree on a common platform and to then be stronger together when they would go for negotiations. And this made it possible for the People Power Revolution to happen. So that internal negotiation and dialogue that Anthony was talking about before is crucial for coalition building to maybe become possible in deeply divided societies.
That's a great answer, thank you. So let's try to, far in the back in the black, I think, or navy blue.
Thank you so much. My name is Sergio Martinez and I am from Catholic University of America and originally from Guatemala. My question is in regards to the leadership structure, and I want to discuss what kind of leadership is ideal in addressing changes for the societies. So my question is, how do you bring inclusive and accountable leadership that holds a balance of power and sustainable collaboration between peace builders and nonviolent civil resistance?
Great question. How to bring in inclusive, accountable leadership?
I think that part of that is how you envision and then build the post-transition constitution, government, laws. Like in Guatemala, you have the weird thing that Efraín Ríos Montt became president after we got rid of the military dictatorship. So that shows that there was an incomplete transition in the way the population was able to figure out what the post-Civil War, post-transitional government would look like. It's not always possible to create the perfect post-transition order, and maybe we have to aim for less than perfection. At the same time, I guess focus on building institutions rather than just prohibiting individuals from getting back to power. The South American transitional justice examples, further south from Guatemala, I think they gave a lot of amnesties out in their early years, and that was probably all they could do. In later years, legislatures overturned some of those amnesties and were able to start prosecuting people for their egregious violations of human rights. That's because there were fewer dangers to judges and lawyers, and there was more of a collective norm of human rights accountability that didn't exist at the earlier stage. So articulating it properly and then getting the timing right, I think, are two parts of that.
Just a quick note, Guatemala is just such a fascinating case where 2 years ago in 2015, a mass, broad-based, nonviolent movement came together focused on corruption that involved virtually every segment of Guatemalan society and resulted in the head of state in a very corrupt inner core resigning power and facing justice. And it's one of the most amazing examples, actually, of broad-based, effective nonviolent resistance in recent history. So anyway, so right up here in the middle, in the white.
Thank you. My name is Kaskonde Abdushafi. I'm from Sudan. Human rights activist, been working for the last 7 years outside Sudan. Thank you for the good lecture. My question is going to Professor Anthony on the relationship between the quality negotiation and the success of civil activism, nonviolence activism. In situation where societies or civil society or the activists themselves are less organized due to the limited space or freedoms and so much oppressions, and the civil society or the groups are less organized in terms of defining their demands or having a shared vision of what they want to make. How could you make a negotiation successful? What kind of really good tools to be used in such situation to make to ensure the quality negotiation? Thank you.
It's a great question. When groups are less organized, how can negotiations emerge and be effective?
I think Gandhi's example was to try to get a symbolic component of society that around which he could mobilize people who might not otherwise come together. The salt satyagraha, the salt protest, was derided by some of his peers at the time, but he understood that this would be a powerful way to unite people across various dividing lines within British Indian society. And that the poor especially would understand the symbolism of it and then come together for the political campaign. So you have to find some unifying themes that are easy to grasp, that mobilize without creating too much hatred. Because mobilization always creates some exclusion that can quite easily spill over into excessive othering. So some symbol around which people can mobilize, but then a limited, I think, agenda for change, not an infinite one, also helps people, I think, to climb on board and say, this will be worth it. And the more of us get together and join into it, the more effective we'll be. It's harder at the beginning, I think, to get large groups of people to coalesce into a single movement. So simplicity, symbolism, the tools of mobilization that are well understood by leaders around the world, as long as they don't spill into demonization of whoever the target is, those are all effective. It helps sometimes to have a supranational identity. You know, we have societies around the world where people don't have an allegiance to a state. They have an allegiance to a local identity that has been sometimes artificially inflated. There was a really cool TV commercial a few years ago in Lebanon during the political campaigns, must have been a decade ago, where Lebanese citizens would go up on the camera one by one and say in Arabic, Anna Sunni, I am a Sunni. Anna Maruni, I'm a Maronite. One by one, each sect would go up, and then finally, in the backdrop behind them, the Lebanese flag fell, the screen turned black, and in white letters, when will we be Lebanese, was the question. Because Lebanese are all, Lebanese in the diaspora. At home, they're all part of a sect. So creating a supranational, an identity that helps people come together is an important part of that. But it can't be too exclusive of others at the same time.
Great, thank you. How about right here in the front? Oh, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Rose Berger. I'm with the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative. And following off of what Anthony just said, Pope Francis has encouraged a process to look at how the Catholic Church can scale up its nonviolent action. I think the Catholic Church as a global entity is in a unique position as a supranational entity as well as a highly locally identified entity. And it also, in its positive formation, has a long experience with peace building. But what he's encouraging now is to look at how to bring nonviolent action alongside of that. So I wonder if the folks here on this panel could talk about what kind of an impact do you think a Vatican Council or a Vatican department on nonviolence and peace building could have in the various contexts around the world?
Great question.
It's just a beautiful thing. I mean, I was part of Pax Christi many years ago, and to have the Vatican say nonviolent activism is all right. It's like having the Secretary of Defense, endorse nonviolent civil resistance as a strategy for change. It's a magnificent thing to have the leadership open itself up to a potentially subversive strategy.
Okay. Yeah,
I agree. I mean, the most recent experience I had of the power of the Vatican was in early April. I was in the Basque Country to witness the demilitarization of the armed organization ETA, which happened actually through a very inclusive civil society-led model that I think should be definitely replicated elsewhere. Come to me if you want to hear more about it. But what was interesting was that the Vatican had sent a representative as a witness to the decision by an armed organization to completely change its strategy of struggle and to decide to give back to the society the weapons that it had taken in defense of that society, and to decide to move forward by political or non-violent means. And the decision to have the Vatican send representative there was, I think, a very powerful symbol that was very much acknowledged and recognized by people.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be a powerful thing if someone like a Pope Francis, who I think by instinct gets the relationship between nonviolent action and peace building, would one day, offer nonviolent action, nonviolence as a prominent theme of the Catholic Church. Yeah, right here, in the white.
Hi, my name is Filiz Odabas Geldiay. I'm the Executive Director of International Association for Human Values. And I have a quick comment and a question. One of the major contributing factors to violence is the lack of adequate programs that teach people how to handle negative emotions. Neither at home nor at school are we ever taught how to handle anger, anxiety, frustration, helplessness, and depression, which in conflict situations escalate and turn into violence. My organization offers these highly researched and evidence-based tools and techniques that, when applied regularly, have been shown to shift people's mindset and make peace sustainable. My question is whether any of the speakers are looking at the importance of such preventive tools into their work for peace.
Okay, and since we're almost getting near the end, why don't we group a few more and then we'll ask the panel to respond kind of collectively to the questions. So very far in the back, standing up.
Thank you. This is a great discussion. My name is Philip Deng, and I'm from South Sudan. Today I'm here with my colleagues who just came last week from South Sudan, Peter and Anul. They're sitting right toward the front. If you can please stand up, Peter and Anul.
Hello.
Hello.
South Sudan is in such a chaos right now as we speak. A lot of violent activities are going on in South Sudan. And I believe personally that the only solution to South Sudanese conflict is not the humanitarian work nor the peacekeeping projects, but rather the U.S. government itself and organizations like USIP to influence the politicians in South Sudan so that the conflict among the tribes and also the communities in South Sudan can be prevented. Peter might be able to elaborate on this topic because he's the human rights activist in South Sudan. He's actively working in South Sudan between the two tribes, the major two tribes right now in South Sudan, which is Dinka and Nuer. And he also has a vast knowledge because he lives there on the ground. And so my question to the panel today is, how do we bring both parties, I'm talking about the government of South Sudan and the rebels leaders who are, by the way, scattered all over the world right now as we speak. None of the leaders for the rebels are actually in South Sudan, but they have influence on their followers in South Sudan to continue the violence. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. One more question. All right, we'll take two since you're very energetic there. And then one here, so we'll get that one.
I'm Doha from Lebanon, and my question was about media, how to convince media that non-violent movement is worth coverage. And also, you were speaking about win-win situation and not excluding certain actors. How we cannot exclude some spoilers, and how we can make win-win situation while some actors being again in authority might regenerate and re-reproduce their systems.
Thank you. And one last one. Start to prepare your...
I'm Indy Reiser. I'm deeply involved with many organizations, but the American Friends Service Committee and Global Peace Services. I want to tease out the role of the media. Now, there are many mechanisms that outreach can occur, but the commercial media, and of course we've been told in the US that there's a lot of fake media, but how can word be put out that shows the various needs and interests of the conflicting sides? That's not very easy to do. There is censorship, there is lack of access, and we're seeing in Turkey how journalists who are trying to be objective are really cut down and in danger of their lives and certainly their positions. So how can groups that are peacemakers and peace activists work with the media to tell their stories but include those that they don't agree with in their tales?
Great, thank you very much. So we have a few minutes to respond however you'd like to dealing with negative emotions and psychosocial dimensions, civil war in South Sudan, media, how to convince the media that nonviolent resistance is worth covering and being able to show different perspectives, and how to engage spoilers.
Okay, very quickly, emotions. I think it's a very interesting point because emotions are often overlooked in such a thing. And in my experience being in revolutions before, revolution is a very emotional moment. I cried in the revolution more than I ever did in my life. I've seen people falling in love to each other in revolution. People hate each other in the revolution. Revolution is an upheaval, not just on a political level, but also in the emotional and the personal level. I mean, think about it. I lived all my life. At that time, I was 26 or 27 in revolution, and I only lived with one president throughout my whole life. So when I actually had a chance and feel the moment that no matter how weak or small I am, is able to bring down a dictator, that was like very emotional. People were hugging each other in the squares, people were loving each other. It was an 18-day of utopia in Egypt, and then later everything changed, but at that time it was an emotion thing. And yes, emotions like pride and shame played later on, as we said before about in the negotiations, how did they halt the negotiations, how also they boost negotiations and many things. So I think it's an interesting point because emotions do play a role in revolutions. About Doha's point on media, I don't think there is actually a way to convince traditional media that they don't have to get involved in that sort of thing, because media live off big events, right? I mean, I wouldn't think of CNN covering a society in Bhutan because they love each other, right? But they will go if there is a war, right? CNN and BBC and so on, they're not interested. If you're peaceful, you're boring, right? It has to be interesting, and to be interesting, you have to be violent, big, doing something, and so on. So even revolutions in the Arab Spring were, as I said before, they're not 100% peaceful, and that's why they gained traction. The third point is, if we really want to provide a counter-narrative or a parallel narratives to media, I think now we do have this platform, the social media, where we actually can present ourselves in the social media. And again, the Arab Spring is an excellent example of that. People signed up with their full profile on Facebook and Twitter and so on to attend multiple events in many parts of the Arab Spring, and they managed to bring down dictators this way. And the governments later on realized the power of social media when they started to have their own pages and communicate with people in that sense. I'll stop here so I can give a chance.
So just very briefly, does anyone else have quick reflections on either South Sudan media or... Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, two reflections. The first one on both the South Sudan question and the part of the Lebanon question on spoilers. I think one needs to understand inclusivity in negotiations as, let's say, a two-level game. I think inclusivity in negotiations means that definitely all potential spoilers need to be there, because if they aren't there, they're going to make sure that the result is not implemented. But at the same time, there is what I would call the vertical dimension, meaning that all affected communities have to be there, and if negotiations are about justice, victims should be there. If negotiations are about land reform, peasants should be there. So I think it's this two-level game that is hard to combine at the same time, but has to be tried. And I think in the case of South Sudan, the US have such an important influence on the parties, and especially has this historic relation with the SPLM, right? And I think that historic relation has very much to be used to put pressure on the government to come forward with an inclusive dialogue, which is not going to be what the official national dialogue that the South Sudanese government now wants to put forward, but to have it a really genuinely inclusive dialogue, again, along this kind of two dimensions. And in terms of media, I think that there is a need to, at the same time, educate journalists on, what is civil resistance and what are different ways that civil resistance can be shown. There's incredible work that is being done by the ICNC, I think, for instance, to document 300 plus ways through which nonviolent action can be waged, or to document creative actions that have been carried out around the world. And so I think the way that nonviolent resistance can be made, I don't know. Sexy, right? It's by, thank you, or dramatic. It's by documenting these very creative ways and proactive ways through which struggles are waged. So it's not only about people going down on the streets, but there's probably very newsworthy ways of resisting that are worth showing. And it's about educating journalists to that dimension, I think.
Okay, and we're over, so just very quickly to wrap us up.
Yeah, I wouldn't go over Sudanese problem because it's other panelists they answered. I would focus a little bit more on media as a journalist myself. Definitely is a problem how much space corporate media they give to the nonviolence strategy or method or revolution. Currently, the two issues the Turkish journalists, I think yesterday, the day before yesterday, they had a trial. And the Al Jazeera issues, the dictators anywhere in the world, dictators they never like. For example, Egypt. President Sisi, he would not allow to any journalist to raise any voices against his regime. Saudis, why Saudis are so much worried about Al Jazeera, that their coverage. And why Turkish Erdogan, President Erdogan is worried about the journalists. His regime is putting most of the journalists in jail, except who support his strategy, his government. So in the U.S., if we look at very few medias, even really they give space to nonviolent or any Wall Street protest or 99% of protest, very little space, because they sell either they support the regime or they sell their products. Who buys their products? That depends on the media.
Okay, thanks very much. And Anthony, just close the panel for us.
Anger and emotions directly connected to negotiation and conflict resolution. If we sort of suppress our emotions, they come out in other ways. The antidote, I think, has always been to learn self-awareness at an individual as well as collective level, and balance empathy with assertiveness. You assert your needs, your grievances, but you empathize and invite empathy.
All right, well, on that note, thank you, first of all, to the panelists for engaging in a really fascinating conversation. Thank you all in the audience for coming out, and till the next time.
Thank you.